We began this lecture series, The African American Experience in Missouri, going on 4 years now. And this is a project that Kiana Irvin and I take very seriously. Kiana Irvin is one of the brightest, smartest, most gifted scholars on this campus. And I'm thrilled that she is a part of the university, and I'm thrilled to be affiliated with her here at the State Historical Society of Missouri. Kiana Irvin teaches history in the history department, also has an appointment in the Black Studies program, and she has a book out that just happens to be for sale here, I think. And so please welcome Kiana Irvin, who will introduce our speaker tonight. And thank you for being here.
He's helping me sell my book. That's really, really awesome of him. Good to see everyone. I'm thrilled to be in this space. This is my first time here. Yeah, it's just remarkable. It's great to see everyone. As Gary said, I'm Kiana Irvin, Associate Professor of History here at Mizzou. And with Dr. Kramer, with the team, the State Historical Society, we bring scholars who study Black historical experiences in Missouri to the MU campus. And we're really proud of the work that we do. We thank those of you who are here. We thank the Missouri Humanities Council, of course, the team at State Historical Society, all of you who are here, our colleagues, our friends, students. And if you are a student and you're here to earn some citizenship at Mizzou Points, please sign the form outside. Maggie's waving here in the back. You can find her and take care of that, okay? So it's my distinct honor to introduce Dr. Charlie Nilon, Professor of Urban Wildlife Management in the University of Missouri School of Natural Resources. He and his students study urban ecology, urban wildlife conservation, and the human dimensions of wildlife conservation. Professor Nilon holds a PhD from the College of Environmental Science and Forestry at the State University of New York. His research considers the impact of urbanization on wildlife habitats, populations, and communities. Since 1997, Professor Nilon has been a co-principal investigator on the Baltimore Ecosystem Study, one of 2 urban ecosystems included in the National Science Foundation's long-term ecological research program. His work with the Baltimore study focuses on understanding how ecological and socioeconomic factors influence bird species composition and abundance. Because urban areas are homes for people as well as wildlife, Dr. Nilon's research also considers the role of nature as part of an individual's day-to-day environment and environmental justice issues associated with access to nature. Professor Nilon and his students have worked on projects in Kansas City and St. Louis that seek to understand how people perceive open spaces in their neighborhood. Recently, he has collaborated with colleagues from the MU School of Medicine on a project studying the kinds of open spaces where children are active. Since 2010, Dr. Nilon has been a principal investigator on 3 different synthesis projects that are compiling data from more than 150 of the world's cities. The projects seek to understand global patterns of biodiversity in cities, the filters that shape species composition in cities, and the social and ecological factors that shape patterns of abundance in cities, and apply all of that information, the robust information, to management, conservation, and planning programs. Dr. Nilon is the author of numerous peer-reviewed articles. He's certainly an institutional leader and a mentor to many students as well as many faculty members, including myself. We're thrilled to have him as our first African American in Missouri series lecturer in this brand new building. So please join me in welcoming him to the podium.
Well, thank you, Kiana and Gary, and thank everybody for coming out tonight. And it's really exciting to have people come for stuff like this because I'm a wildlife biologist, and usually when I go to wildlife conferences and you talk about this stuff, urban people are in the back room, kind of in the corner and everything, and so it's kind of cool to come to this and see a lot of people here. I'm going to talk tonight about actually 2 research projects that I've been involved with my graduate students in St. Louis. And they relate to the African American experience and the African American history in St. Louis because they're both projects that were efforts In one case by a group of private conservation groups who are interested in developing a trail along the riverfront. And in the other case, a city-led effort to really develop conservation programs in urban neighborhoods in North City. So as I got involved with that, I got interested in a lot about the history of North City. And because I'm not from St. Louis and I do work there, so I've gotten interested in that. And so as part of my research, I've had a chance to learn a lot about North City and actually do some research on that, as well as trying to understand both the ecological and social aspects of conservation projects in a predominantly African American community. So I'm going to see if I do this right and get started. I did. Okay. So my project my work takes place in North City. And I'm not from St. Louis. When I first got there, I wondered what North City was. And North City literally means North City. So if you're a St. Louis person, you know that North City is basically north of Del Mar. And there's a website called stlouispatina.com, which has this nice quote, and it says, for the past 60 years of St. Louis history, the North Side has remained the most misunderstood, stereotyped, and neglected section of the city. So my research takes place there, and the places where my students and I are studying birds and wildlife habitat are in North City. So I was interested in, well, how did this come to be? Why are we looking at these kinds of places? What shaped those? And particularly, again, what's the experience of the people who've been living there, say, the last 60 years? So St. Louis, North City is defined as being north of Del Mar. And as this mentions up here, this is an area that if you read the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and watch St. Louis TV stations, you get the impression that it's a place that's dangerous, it's unsafe, it's scary, it's violent, people are killed, all these horrible things are happening. But it's also a place that has stable neighborhoods, it has institutions, it has churches, it has parks, has all kinds of different kinds of green spaces, and it has people who are very proud of living there, as well as very stable neighborhoods. So part of what I'm interested in is what experience do people have in these neighborhoods with the nature around them? Also, what kind of factors shape those experiences, as well as shape experiences for, I guess, wildlife? I guess birds don't really have experiences, but how do birds use these kinds of places in these existing habitats? So my research, as Dr. Irvin mentioned, is framed in three different ways. First, I'm a wildlife ecologist, and wildlife ecology has a subdiscipline of urban ecology. So there are lots of traditions in how people study cities and ideas about saying that all habitats across the city are important, and that's important to look at habitats around where people live. But I've tried to frame a lot of my work recently over three different themes. One is environmental justice. The second is a concept called everyday nature, and the third is something called popular values of nature. I'm going to take a little time to explain those, and then we'll go into the body of the talk. So environmental justice is a couple things. It has an activist tradition, which goes back probably 40 or 50 years and started in North Carolina as sort of an organized activity. It also has a strong scholarly tradition, which is covered by people like Dr. Robert Bullard at Texas A&M University, people like Beverly Wright here in the slide at the top of the slide, and more recent scholars like Nick Heinen at the University of Georgia. So all of these folks are interested in this primary question about how does inequality shape people's experience with the environment. And they're talking about unequal treatment that might be based on race or ethnicity, on gender, on a variety of other identities people might have. And a key part of this is that these are not just coincidental differences, but they're systemic. And a lot of the research in this topic searches for mechanisms that might explain why these differences occur. So I'm interested in how access to green space, experience of nature might be an environmental justice issue, and then what might shape those. Second, there's a concept that comes from environmental psychology called everyday nature. Everyday nature was developed by two scholars at University of Michigan, Rachel Kaplan and Stephen Kaplan, who are both environmental psychologists at the University of Michigan. And they looked at this idea of how do people form their perceptions about nature, and what shapes their experience of nature and how they actually act on it. So they were interested in this concept, or developed this concept, that the place near where people live, within about a mile of home, is where they have their strongest environmental connections. It's where they make decisions about how they manage the environment, It's where they make decisions about their preferences for the environment. And these places are very much places that are real. There's a physical environment there, and that physical environment is connected to what people like, their preferences, their fears, those kinds of things. And then finally, that idea about places that are everyday places or places that people manage is really important in wildlife conservation and management in cities. So, for example, if you think about the processes that go into everyday nature, they're bottom-up processes, which relate to people's everyday experience, the things they want to see in their yard, the legacies of where they live, those kinds of things are bottom-up processes that shape everyday nature. And then there are top-down processes that shape it through cities' planning and zoning efforts, restrictive covenants and segregation. So I'm using those kinds of things as a framework for looking at what's going on in North City. And then finally, there are concepts, something called popular values of nature. And the best way to describe that is that we as managers, when I say a manager, I say wildlife biologists, managers, those kinds of things, think of values that people might hold for nature or that certain places have. And the idea of that is these are often based on science, they're based on expert knowledge. Yet people like Carolyn Harrison and Jacqueline Burgess at the top of the slide, who did work in England in the early 1980s, talked about the idea that there are these popular values people hold for nature, and that these values often shape people's experiences, and they also often shape how people respond to different management decisions and different things going on in their neighborhood. And this work has extended to people like Audrey Muritet and Teddy Sharif, who are people who do work in other European cities on trying to understand the role that popular values shape in things like how people understand management for biodiversity, their experience in parks, and so on. So that's another framework I'm trying to use. And popular values of nature in particular talk about a couple things. First, they talk about this role of elite values often held by researchers and managers. They talk about the popular values held by people in areas, and which consist of things like enjoyment of day-to-day contact with nature. The idea that what people see in their everyday experience is important, and that nature, the plants and animals, are important that they see every day. The social aspects of nature, the fact that people look at these places as places they can enjoy, visit, and so on. And then finally, the darker sides of nature, things that people might be afraid of, risk, safety, those kinds of things. For example, people's concerned about their personal safety, about contacts with animals they might not want, about safety from the police, a variety of other things. And there are things which often come up as popular values. So those are the three frameworks I'm looking at. And finally, what all these lead to are the idea that when you're looking at wildlife conservation in North City, trying to understand what created the pattern of wildlife habitats, the vacant lots, the parks, the greenways, all those kinds of things, it's important to remember that that was an active process, that people actually did this. So there are residents who make decisions, there are local governments who make decisions, the real estate organizations in St. Louis, federal policy, banks, all these people have shaped what green space in the city look like, and the people who live now in those neighborhoods through things like ordinances, zoning policy, restrictive covenants, real estate practices, mortgage insurance, urban renewal, and planning and design. So start out with a question then about, in North City, what's really shaped the current pattern of places that are wildlife habitats in the city, and also more importantly, what shapes what people actually experience and why those people are where they are in North City. So starting out, this is a map of St. Louis, and you're going to see several maps like this, which I realized are reversed from the way most people think of St. Louis, because north is on the right-hand side of the picture instead of on the top. I don't know why that is, but apparently people who made maps in St. Louis in the 1930s like to make maps from the opposite perspective. So this is St. Louis, and I think that worked. Can't tell. That does. Okay, so whoops, sorry. Okay, so I gave you some orientation. This is Bell Fountain Cemetery and Calvary Cemetery. This is O'Fallon Park. This is Forest Park. This is downtown the river. So that gives you some orientation. But what this map starts out showing is it raises the question that's pretty important throughout the rest of what we'll talk about. And this shows where the Black community in St. Louis was in 1930. And the story of why that community was there in 1930 and what maintained it there has a lot to do with the pattern we're going to talk about things like where vacant lots are, where different parks are, and different kinds of amenities that relate to wildlife and wildlife habitat. So this shows that the Black community is restricted primarily to an area that's called the Mill Creek Valley, which is now about where Highway 64 is, and just east of St. Louis University and just south of Harris Stowe State College, and then along Highway 64, and then extending north to just south of Fairgrounds Park. And part of the processes that shaped where the Black community is and where really it was over time until the 1950s were through several processes. First, St. Louis is unique. We all know St. Louis is unique. We know that Missouri is unique. One thing that made St. Louis unique was it was one of the very few cities that actually passed an ordinance mandating segregation. So in 1916, the city of St. Louis held a referendum that required that realtors could not sell property to a white person in a neighborhood that was more than 75% Black, and they couldn't sell houses in white neighborhoods to Black people that were more than 75% white. And you see that a lot of the argument made about this was about sort of the fear of the Black community spreading in St. Louis, and the risk. You see the headline on that says, look at these homes now, an entire block by Negro invasion, save your home, and so on. And then paper on the left talks about the response of the St. Louis Argus, which is a Black paper. This ordinance passed, and then it was actually overturned in the court a few years later, along with several other similar ordinances in other cities. So the next step in sort of maintaining this process of sort of constraining the Black community related to the process of restrictive covenants. And this map shows the black shows where there are restrictive covenants, which basically would limit who you could sell your house to. And many of these covenants would say you could not sell it to a Black person, you could not sell it to a Jewish person, a variety of things, but it was designed to basically restrict where people could live in St. Louis. And you'll notice that at the top, on the right-hand side of the slide, sort of this boundary around where the Black community is. So it's on the north side of sort of what's now near North St. Louis, and it's on the west side near Kings Highway. So again, it's kind of constraining the Black community. And then to the east and to the south, there were railroad tracks, the river, and other things in downtown. So basically, this was designed to sort of keep the Black community in place. Okay. And in 1948, there's a legal case, Shelley versus Kramer, which overturned restrictive covenants actually nationwide. So on the left, you see Mrs. Shelley reading the Post-Dispatch about overturning that. And that's to actually see the Shelley House, which is still standing as a National Historic Site. So this overturned restrictive covenant. So starting in the 1950s, Black residents of St. Louis could, at least in theory, move anywhere they wanted in the city. Okay, so now we get into the role of things like federal policy, something which comes in through the Homeowners Loan Corporation, urban renewal, and public housing, which are all federal policies that started in the 1930s and 1940s. And this Homeowners Loan Corporation essentially was support for loans to homeowners, as the title says, but what it actually involved was ranking of neighborhoods based on socioeconomic characteristics and what were presumed to be the ability of people to pay back the loans and for banks to invest. So what this map shows, the areas in orange or kind of pink were areas which had the lowest rankings. So again, if you look at this suggests that the areas which were probably Black neighborhoods in St. Louis were the areas where it was hardest to get loans. Whereas on the other hand, as you look out into the suburban St. Louis, it's very easy to get loans. So one thing this did was it started a process which made it easier for white residents to move around throughout the city and for Black residents to be more restricted in where they moved. Then additional things went on. In 1956, or the mid to late 1950s, the city of St. Louis used urban renewal money from the federal government to start the process of tearing down the Mill Creek neighborhood. So on the left, you see a picture of the mayor looking out over Mill Creek. And on the right, you see a picture after this whole area was taken out. And this displaced about 16,000 people. So it had a major impact, again, on the city. So the final part of this that we'll mention then was public housing. So city also used federal funds to provide for public housing, building public housing, which remained segregated. And so what all this process led to was having, again, a large number of Black residents in the city, which in the 1950s was over 800,000 people who were concentrated in a relatively small geographic area, and then a mechanism where whites could start to be able to buy housing in other places outside the city and in other places in St. Louis. So planning and design, which I have in the wrong slide, so we'll come back to that, I apologize, but planning and design, my slides are in the wrong place. But this next three slides talk about are the role of what's now called essentially blockbusting. And this is the role of real estate agents in shaping where people live in St. Louis. So we're going to show a project done at Washington University looking at segregation in housing, and they show a single property, and they point out that the owner of this property bought it in the 1930s and lived there until he sold the house in 1959. So they start out and show that this house on Wells Avenue, which is just south, is at Union and just south of, just north of Page and just south of Union, or just east of Union. And the house in St. Louis was in a neighborhood in 1940, which is 0.23% Black. In other words, it had 27 Black residents out of over 8,000 residents. When the house was sold in 1959, the homeowner moved from the house on Wells to a house on Geraldine, which is near O'Fallon Park and was now called Walnut Park East. And at the time that homeowner moved, the neighborhood was now 6,500 people with 8,700% Black, 87% Black residents. So there'd been this big change. But what the point of showing this graphic is, if you look at Geraldine, which is a neighborhood that's remained white. So when he moved, that neighborhood was still white. So the process that people at WashU talk about was that this is a process which allowed, again, white residents to be able to move anywhere in the city, but Black residents still faced a lot of restrictions on where they could buy, who people would sell to, and so on. So essentially what's going on is a process where white residents get a lot of encouragement to be able to move out of their homes, and Black residents move into those homes, but they're restricted from where they can move beyond that. So this starts to create a process of having homes which are decreasing in value because people can get loans, and more residents are moving into these. So this starts creating a process which eventually is going to lead to a lot of vacancy. And finally, we get to some legacies of planning and design, the slide was in the right place now. These legacies are the following. First, final two things which went on, I want to talk about, are the actual city planning processes. So for example, this is O'Fallon Park. At the center of the slide to the north would be Calvary Cemetery. And what you're seeing in this picture is St. Louis in the 1930s before I-70. So I-70 is going to come in right to the north of O'Fallon Park and then go down on the east side of the park all the way downtown. So big change, putting in highways, changing neighborhoods, those kinds of things are also a legacy of the decisions the city made, which changed the landscape of the city. And then finally, people also design things. So O'Fallon Park, Bell Fountain Cemetery, Calvary Cemetery are all examples of a design period that took place in the 1870s and 1880s. This is called the picturesque landscape design, which had certain features. It's designed to be a sort of romantic vision of sort of almost a European landscape, but applied in the United States. And so there are these big design spaces throughout the city as well, that are still present in North City. So this is the setting where my students and I have been looking at wildlife and wildlife habitats and people, and we're going to talk about two projects. First project we're going to talk about is a project called Riverfront Trail. And the general neighborhoods that were involved with this were what's now called Old North St. Louis, which used to be called Murphy Blair, an area called College Park, which is kind of a mix of the area, this Hyde Park and College Park, and then Baden to the north. And this project, so this project looks a lot at this idea of where do people visit, where are they active, what kind of places they enjoy seeing. Well, the background on this was on the right to see the plan for the North Riverfront Trail. And the North Riverfront Trail was an idea that was developed by TrailNet, and which is a volunteer group in St. Louis, and was advocated very strongly by actually the alderman on the north side of St. Louis, as well as Grace Hill Settlement House. Grace Hill Settlement House has a history in North City that goes back to 1903. It's a place that's been very active and very engaged with local residents from when it was a predominantly immigrant community for people from Germany to now when it's predominantly African-American neighborhood. So Grace Hill has had a very strong local presence. And Grace Hill's focus on North Riverfront Trail was looking at this as an opportunity for economic development, for involving local residents, and also for conservation and management. So they had a vision for using Riverfront Trail as a way of really engaging people in North City neighborhoods. Okay. And the North City Sustainable Communities Project, which came out of this, was funded through a grant from USCPA through their Environmental Justice Challenge grants. And it was very much a grassroots initiative that Grace Hill led, but involved MU, University of Missouri, St. Louis, and some other organizations and universities. But Grace Hill Settlement House was, again, active in it. They were focused on neighborhood revitalization. And then finally, they were really interested in this idea of access, because they pointed out that residents living in many of the North City neighborhoods, to walk the maybe half mile to I-70 means, or to the river, means they have to go about 3 miles north to find a bridge, cross I-70, and then go across that. So the idea of people being cut off, not having access to the river and so on, was a really big part of Grace Hill's interest. Now, Grace Hill also was actively engaged in neighborhood outreach activities around Riverfront Trail. They were active in developing the Mary Meacham Freedom Crossing site, which commemorates Mary Meacham, who was a free Black woman in St. Louis, and she and her husband, John Barry Meacham, were involved with the Underground Railroad and helping slaves escape into Illinois. And the site is where they were actually stopped when they were trying to help some people escape across the river. And it became famous because one of the people they were helping escape was a slave of Henry Shaw, who was Missouri Botanical Garden founder. So this connection with that meant that it was publicized, the trial was publicized and all this. So this is one of the few Underground Railroad sites in St. Louis that's actually recorded. So Grace Hill has been involved in commemorating that. They worked with the Missouri Historical Society in commemorating the site. They do activities and things like that. And in the 1990s, they were very active in working on the design and the interpretive material, and they got often several hundred people showing up for some of their activities. They also had a trail ranger program for several years with people from the neighborhood who they would train to be volunteers on the trail, to interpret it, to go do programs in schools and so on. And they also have done things like they have a flood wall mural on the flood wall. So they have a number of activities, and they're trying to connect people to the river. So our project starts out with Jeff Azarad, who was a grad student here, and Jeff was involved in trying to look at birds and bird habitat. So the first thing he wanted to do was really identify what are birds and bird habitat. Now, identifying birds means go out and count birds, but bird habitat means you're trying to describe what are these places in North City along Riverfront Trail that are important. So part of this involved identifying certain kinds of habitats, identifying the actual things about those places that make them good habitat for birds, and making recommendations for management. So we started out with working with, in this case, Grace Hill. So this is Ariette, who was led the Trail Ranger program for Grace Hill in the 1990s, and she's involved in the mapping process. So we worked with Grace Hill. We trained a lot of their staff on how to do some of the assessments we did, and she's going out mapping places. We mapped every place in between north of Cass Avenue and all the way up to North Riverfront Trail, and then along Florissant Road from Grand and Florissant all the way to Halls Ferry Circle. So it's a big area that we looked at. And we went out and classified this. So all these codes on the left are just different types of vegetation we found. And the sort of blue color would be just places that are built and paved, but all the other colors represent a variety of different kinds of habitats that are in an area that's a mix of industrial areas that were cut off from the river by the flood wall, properties for different industries, the jail, car lots, all kinds of things are in that area, as well as on the west side, O'Fallon Park, Bell Fountain Cemetery, Calvary Cemetery. And at the very northwest side of the park of Calvary Cemetery is native prairie. So there are remnants of these very important natural places. They're sites that have been shaped by abandoned industry and everything in between. So we did bird counts and we found birds. Okay. And we also went out and assessed all these individual parcels we looked at different characteristics. So we looked at things like the ground cover, the kind of vegetation, the species of trees, and so on, and to try to better understand the link between the kind of habitats we're seeing and the bird species we found. So we looked and we found that if you now translate these different codes into more useful language, there are things like forests, which are closed canopy forests. We found woodlands or open canopy woodlands. We found kind of shrub thickets, lots and lots of meadow and lawns. So meadows are where it's kind of weedy grass, remnant prairies, things like that. And lawn is mowed lawn. We found wetlands. We found tall forests. And what we're also showing in here, though, what the different bars indicate are where we found the most species, so the most bird species. So, for example, we found lots of bird species in meadow and lawn habitat, and we found lots of bird species in woodland and forest habitat. And that may sound kind of trivial, but we're going to talk later on about the context where we see those. But these are also important because these are places where most people in North City actually are visiting. So as you go out, you see just for some of the common species, things like robins, starlings, cardinals, red-winged blackbirds, common grackles as typical urban birds. They have different levels of abundance in different places in these habitats. But the key thing we found was that there are lots of places that have lawn and grass and mowed areas. And what you're seeing in this top picture is the trail, which in this case is running on top of the levee. And if you look over on the left-hand side of that picture, you see that there is this kind of flat area. And that flat area is what's called a fill site. So fill sites are places where the Corps of Engineers gives the city permission to dump clean fill in. So the levee is 15 feet above the river level, and you're looking at a place, again, that's been filled up to that 15 feet. So you're seeing a place that's a fill site, but these fill sites typically aren't mowed. They're grassy, and there are lots of grassland bird species, dick thistles, and all kinds of species, meadowlarks and things which use these kinds of habitats are found in those kinds of places. Open woodland sites are what a lot of O'Fallon Park and Bell Fountain Cemetery and Calvary Cemetery look like. So these places, again, attract some unique species of birds. So we found that these two very common settings are really important. Now, so the next part of the project related to people, and we wanted to look at use, perception, and value. And a second MU faculty member, Neil Moisey, who was in the Department of Parks, Recreation, and Tourism here at MU, had students who worked on this. And Karen Dockeny, who was his graduate student, did two different projects. First, she worked on a survey of trail users, and this is a survey of residents in North City. And she also met with people in neighborhoods to talk with them about their views about the trail. And one of the things she found in the survey was information that goes against what most people think is common for Black visitors anywhere, and particularly less common for Black visitors who might be viewed as, say, low income or deprived, or all the other terms that people sometimes use when they talk about residents in North City. They found that first, about a third or over a third of the visitors on the trail were Black. Second, they found that the majority of visitors came from North City. So this trail, which was set up really to serve the sort of regional users, was really attracting local people. It was also attracting a large number of Black residents of North City. And what they found also was interesting was that, again, a lot of the literature said that, Black visitors really have different recreation patterns. And what were different in this case was people there fished a lot, and they did wildlife viewing. The wildlife viewing part is really interesting that people talked about, because we see bald eagles on the trail, we see birds, we really like being out in nature and those kind of things. We saw people rabbit hunting, which is illegal, but people were rabbit hunting. So there's lots of activities that people were doing. And And so something about this place seemed to be attracting people. So the next part of this was Karen went out and they had several meetings with residents. And one of these meetings, they had a floor to ceiling thing about the size of the screen they put up with this picture on it. And they asked residents to talk about places they thought were important. They met with 4 different groups. And what we found was we began to try to understand, or Karen began to try to understand what might explain why people valued some of the places where they used them. And she found first that the very first thing people said was, in North City, there are no grocery stores, there are no banks, there's nothing here. There are no drugstores, there are no services. And what they said they really wanted to see were people to address that. But they also talked about that what they really liked were places where you can be active, where you can be outside, where you can play, where you can socialize, where you can have contact with nature, all those kinds of things. And they said, Riverfront Trail provides that. And O'Fallon Park and some of the other parks also provide that. So people are using these places because they provide resources, they provide things people are excited about. The next part of the project, we continued the neighborhood meetings and we asked people to really start thinking about particular places. And we actually had pictures. We had a book with pictures, a lot of these different green spaces in the city or North City. And we asked people to kind of rank them and talk about what they liked about them, what they would want to do on those sites, or what they disliked. So we found that the most popular places were places that looked kind of open and park-like. In other words, places which are open woodlands habitat. People really like those. They said they liked them because they have trees and grass. They look cared for. They look safe. They look like places where you could relax and do things. And they also talked about they look nice. So these places which are very park-like, people liked. They also liked the grasslands too as well. Places they didn't look like. Now, this is a picture of a salvage yard, which obviously is not wildlife habitat, and people did not say they disliked the salvage yard, but what they talked about was the place behind it. And these are places which are these really brushy, scrubby places, and they look neglected. One person described it as a place where you dump a body. They look dangerous. They're in bad locations. In other words, people say, I know where this place is. I don't want to go out there. And they also look like they're trash. So basically, places that don't look like they're cared for, that look unsafe, those kind of things people avoided. So now we're going to switch from Riverfront Trail to look at another project. We're going to double back at the end and talk about North Riverfront Trail. Now we're going to switch to the west side of North City and look in particular at the Wells Goodfellow neighborhood. And Wells Goodfellow is on the very northwest side. If you know St. Louis and know where the Wellston Metrolink stop is, that's about where Wells Goodfellow is, except it's in the city. And also in the Baden neighborhood. And this is a project called the Green City Coalition. I'll explain this very briefly. Green City Coalition has been set up by the city of St. Louis as a collaboration among a number of nonprofit groups, the city, Missouri Department of Conservation, Missouri Botanical Garden, and Metropolitan Sewer District to address a couple issues. The first one is stormwater management, to try to reduce stormwater runoff in a lot of neighborhoods. It's also designed to try to rehabilitate vacant lots. And so the idea of this project really is start thinking about what do projects like this mean in the neighborhood, and how do people perceive the neighborhood or perceive the project, and also how do they view the wildlife that's there, and also what do these projects do as far as wildlife. So this is the nice vision they have, and this is an architect rendering. You can tell that because it has invisible people. There's kind of translucent you can see through. But this is a drawing, this is an architect's rendering of some of these projects. And you see that the goal that Green City Coalition has, and what they say, is to connect people and nature. So the idea is that by really managing these lots in different ways, they'll attract birds, they'll attract other wildlife species, they'll provide different kinds of habitats, they'll have community gardens, they'll have gazebos, they'll have flowering trees, all the things people really like, and to see that people will walk around and they'll enjoy the place. So that's the idea of their vision. Now, the place where this is occurring, the two places where they've been very active, they work on 3 neighborhoods. They work on Walnut Park East near O'Fallon Park. They work on Baden, which we just talked about, and now they're working on Wells Goodfellow. So these maps show the location, and what you see in here is there's lots and lots of green in these pictures. And a lot of that green actually are vacant lots. So Wells Goodfellow in particular had a lot of industry. It's had lots of areas torn down. So Wells Goodfellow, I think we found over 600 vacant lots in Wells Goodfellow alone. So these are places which have had a lot of things happening. In this case, Sebastian Moreno, who was a grad student here at MU, worked on this project, and he was also involved in some of the same things that Jeff did. So he started out by trying to describe these places. So went out, worked on describing these places, and you see there are a range of everything from on the left, essentially a home site where the house has been torn down is vacant, a site which is completely overrun by weeds, and then a whole range of places which include vacant homes or trees growing out of the middle of them, vacant lots, all sort of mixed together. And he went again and classified these areas, and you can really see in this with the different colors how much vacant land there is in these neighborhoods. They're large parcels, they're small parcels, and so on. But we found that there were 180 individual sort of parcels in Baden and 667 in Wells Goodfellow. And these sites, if you look at the size of the site, Baden's 77 acres and Wells Goodfellow is 203 acres. So this means that there's 667 vacant lots in a 200-acre neighborhood. So there's a lot of vacancy. And again, you can look at what these lots look like. They have lots of mowed area. They have a lot of, some areas which are just kind of weedy. These 7% things are kind of weedy. Lots of pavement. Closed forest, and here means places where they're just completely overgrown. So that's where we get a lot of trees. There are a variety of kinds of habitats there. Now, so we went out and we wanted to look at birds. And in this case, we're looking at birds not so much for which is the most important place for conservation, but maybe as kind of a window of trying to understand how different management practices associated with Green City Coalition might actually change neighborhoods and maybe improve the kind of nature that people see. So Sebastian went out, he did bird counts in 2017 to 2018. In this case, he did counts in residential neighborhoods. He looked at habitat in people's yards. And remember that a lot of these streets have vacant lots embedded in them. So he's interested in how all these vacant lots and a lot of the vacancy in this neighborhood really impact what kind of birds in the neighborhoods and what people might experience and so on. So he found 53 species, and most of what he found were fairly common things like starlings, robins, common grackles, cardinals, and chimney swifts. But what he found in a lot of the vacant lots were actually some birds which are a little more unique. Dick thistles, red-winged blackbirds, cedar waxwings, northern flickers, things like that, which is very different kinds of habitats, which suggests that these lots may have some value for conservation of birds. And he also looked at what are in people's yards. And what I highlighted in red are some really the important things. And we found that first, most streets where there are houses in Wells Goodfellow have lots of pavement. They have lots of grass. And at the very bottom, it talks about shrub cover and tree cover. There's very little tree cover and shrub covers. What's happened is all the trees have died and the city hasn't replanted the trees. So you're seeing neighborhoods where there's been a lot of neglect. There's been a lot of things happening in there. And so these are places where there are lots of opportunities to maybe doing things with vegetation, manage them more intensively. So what this means is that in general, if you want to see things like more cardinals and more robins, you can do things like plant trees in residential lots, plant shrubs in residential lots, and also green vacant lots. It also means that if you want to see things like more dick thistles and more red-winged blackbirds, that you can change how you manage the lots as well, maybe focus more on meadows and prairies and less lawn and maybe more shrub cover, things like that. So these gives a suggestion of what you might do for bird conservation on these places. Now, the plans, however, as we mentioned before, the city and Green City Coalition have lots of plans, and this has been a project that, because of how it was funded, there was lots of money involved initially and a very top-down approach to a lot of the planning. So the initial plans had these very detailed plans, as they say on here. They're going to put in amphitheaters and pavilions. They're going to have paved plazas. They're going to do all these kinds of things across in this case, Wells Goodfellow. And so one of the questions that came up in our project was this, that the city has had lots of involvement and Green City Coalition has had lots of public meetings, lots of things going on. But one of the questions that's come up in this has been the role of actual involvement of people. And a colleague, Andrew Hurley, who some of you know, University of Missouri St. Louis, who's a historian, has worked a lot on this question about really what level of involvement they've had and what they could do to maybe make this more relevant. So Drew Malinak, who's another grad student in our department, worked on a project looking at how Wells Goodfellow and Baden residents perceive the vacant lots, what they think about the management plans for the lots, and also how they perceive the actual nature that occurs on those lots. And he found that the things that really shape how people feel about what they see on the lots and what they want to see happens comes from a pretty wide range of factors. First, the idea about community change, which I'll talk about in a second, but community change really says a lot of stuff's happened in this neighborhood that was an outcome of all the processes I talked about at the beginning of the talk. Ideas about safety, and in this case, they mean safety in terms of their physical safety. People say, I don't like the lots because there's crime, there's prostitution, there's drug use, people get killed, those kinds of things, they're not safe. Next, the idea about neighborhood care. And in other words, is there enough investment in the neighborhood to really keep the lots viable and so on? And that means both care by residents and by the city. And then finally, the actual cost of maintaining the lots. But what we found as far as concerns were, in particular, were that there's a large perception that the city has given up on these neighborhoods, particularly in Wells Goodfellow. People said, I moved here in the 1960s. Remember, we talked about people moving to Wells Goodfellow in these neighborhoods in the 60s. I moved there. I grew up there. I moved away. I came back to buy my parents' house. I live here now. And what was a viable neighborhood, everything's gone. The houses are torn down. The schools are closed. Everything's changed in the neighborhood. Some of these concerns are that the city is planning on gentrifying the neighborhood. And they talk about other examples of other places in North City where new development is being proposed. They talk about the idea that no one really asked them would they rather have houses and stores on the lots, or would they rather have the lots be for nature. And they also, again, talk about the idea of safety and services by the police and a variety of other factors. So I'll talk again about this idea about community change. That again, community change, people talk about changes in housing. They talk about the fact that what used to be a vibrant neighborhood now is all this vacant land. They talk about changes in services. For example, this is Barrett Brothers Park in the lower right-hand corner, a place that's valued by a lot of people. Also a place that is viewed as being kind of derelict and really abandoned by the city. They talk about the fact that wildlife and nature is often viewed as an outcome of community change. So places are weedy, they look trashed. You see animals coming, you see things like possums and raccoons in houses and all the vacant lots and those kind of things in the abandoned buildings. So people often view wildlife as being actually a negative side of these changes occurring in neighborhoods. However, the valued places, again, are places that are viewed as being safe, that are viewed as looking cared for. One comment we got a lot was people said like places in West County, and several people pointedly said like places where white residents of the St. Louis area live, places that enhance the neighborhood, and places that are useful. So useful means place where you can play, where you could do something, where there are activities and so on. So these are the kind of places, again, that people have talked about as being valued. Now, our conclusions about this, and really to wrap up what we've found, are a couple things. At the beginning, I talked about the idea of some of these places as contested spaces. And one of the things we talked about when we say contested spaces just means are places where there's a lot of debate about how they should be managed. The one thing we found was that first, what shapes a lot of this are the legacy of the changes that have occurred in North City. And that often may drive how people view some of these conservation efforts. So, for example, if you look at Riverfront Trail was a place where the places like O'Fallon Park, Bell Fountain Cemetery, Calvary Cemetery, Levee, all these places were places that people went to. They've been there a long time. They're familiar with them, and they're not really viewed as being sort of these negative outcomes of what happened in the city. In the city, and so people seem they seem very engaged because of the efforts of Grace Hill Settlement House. So people's experience of nature also matter in that when people go out to these places in Riverfront Trail, they're seeing places where the species are in an attractive setting. Places that are valuable for wildlife also are valuable for people. On the other hand, if you look at a place like Green City Coalition and neighborhoods there, they're in a neighborhood where it's been a more top-down project for a variety of reasons. It's been a project where even though residents are involved, they don't really feel that someone's advocating for them. They don't feel that they're really engaged in the process. So in some cases there's more rejection of some of the vision. Also, what they're seeing, their day-to-day experiences don't really contribute to thinking of these places as being valuable places for wildlife. Okay. So this work is part of a project that's ongoing. At least the second part of it is the Green City Coalition part is ongoing. We're working a lot with the city to try to figure out how to incorporate a lot of the wildlife work into some of the ongoing planning. There's several other groups involved, people at Washington University, at St. Louis University, at University of Missouri, St. Louis are all involved in this, as well as lots and lots of conservation groups. So it's a big project and lots of residents as well. But I would like to acknowledge several people whose work really mine builds on. Doug Eller was the neighborhood services coordinator for Grace Hill Settlement House, and really was my connection to working with Grace Hill. Andrew Hurley is a historian at UMSL and does a lot of research in North City, and a lot of his research really contributes to this talk. I mentioned all my grad students. Neil Moisey is a faculty member who used to be here at Missouri, and my colleague Bob Pierce, and I've collaborated on this project, and his work's really important with that. And then finally, I should acknowledge EPA, National Science Foundation, who funded part of the work we do in Green City Coalition, their Department of Conservation, and I put National Science Foundation twice apparently, but they're important too. So thank you for your time, your attention, your interest, and I'll be glad to answer any questions.
The National Geospatial project that's happening, obviously that was a similar space. It's outside of what your area of study was, but how that changed all the environment there with all that being pulled out. What happens with all the species that were there? Do they relocate to another area? Do you have anything that you could shed light on that?
So he's asking, I don't know how many people are familiar with the National Geospatial Project, but this is what used to be called Defense Mapping Agency. I think it's what it used to be called, but it's a U.S. Department of Defense facility in St. Louis. And they built a new facility, or they're building a new facility from basically just north of Cass and Jefferson, kind of, so the north part, which would be kind of an area right between Riverfront Trail and kind of the areas to the west. And part of this, so there's a big area which is lots of space, and a lot of this was vacant. A lot of it has been torn down over the last few years. Across the street from it is the Pruitt-Igoe site, which is a 50-acre site that's been vacant for 50 years and has big trees and really interesting place kind of ecologically. So I guess to answer your question, I think one thing would be probably, especially the Pruitt-Igoe site, that's a big block, that's a green area. And so that's going to be pretty significant impact, because I've taken my class there and there are quail and there are rabbits and all kinds of things using that. And it's a pretty significant site. So that probably would have an impact. I think a lot of the species there, what you saw from the data, especially for Wells Goodfellow, was most of the species you have to see this in terms of birds are pretty much the everyday kind of birds you see in an urban neighborhood. So it's not that different. What probably may change would be for the larger vacant areas, which are a little less maintained. That's where you're seeing some more unique species. So things like the dick sissels, which are grassland bird, those kind of things might disappear. As an aside, one of the things that a lot of people talked about when Drew did his interviews, they talked about that site a lot. They talked about, I think it's Paul McKee, is the gentleman's name. So Paul McKee is a gentleman in St. Louis who basically bought up a lot of vacant lots. I mean, literally thousands of vacant lots in St. Louis. And there's all kinds of speculation about what his intentions are, but part of it related to the fear that this might lead, he's trying to gentrify the neighborhood. In other words, that once these new things go in, he'll sell the lots to people. It's going to change the neighborhood. So there's a lot of discussion about that. There was also a lot of discussion about just concerns about that the city cares about that neighborhood, but doesn't care about other neighborhoods. So there's a lot going on with that.
We live in those neighborhoods as they are. We take care of our parks, like we take our brooms out and we sweep up the parks so that our children can stay there. It's good. Soon as there's a city-funded movement to improve these green spaces, what happens next? what she says. It's not that we're moving out, it's that we are moved out. We can no longer afford the housing that we actually have already lived in. The houses that sometimes we own, also, what happens? Property taxes, right? We became eminent domain. All of these things, this is traditionally what happens. It's not what we think will happen. It's what we've seen happens. The neighborhood that you're talking about, that's exactly what happened. Eminent domain came in. As soon as somebody had an idea that this space should be developed, now it's too good for the community that was already there. So it's almost as if you have to choose.
Yeah.
Do you want lovely green spaces, or do you want to keep your home?
I think that's an excellent point. I mean, I think one of the things that we heard a lot were, a lot of concern people raised that we talked to were people said, okay, somebody said, okay, I grew up here, I want to stay here. A lot of people said, I grew up here, I moved out to West County somewhere, and then I came back because, my mom had passed. I didn't want the house to be, to go vacant, all that. So they've invested, One thing I'll put a plug for on the YouTube site, look up Missouri Place Stories, which is a website that Andrew Hurley's done. He interviewed a lot of people about these, and there's a gentleman that talks about, all the investors put in his home, all the stuff's going on, and they talk about these concerns that, like you said, that the city's just kind of waiting to reinvest in that, to quote, reinvest in the neighborhood. So that is a concern they talk about a lot.
Time maybe for one more question. What's a tall forb?
No, go ahead.
What's a forb? F-O-R-B.
A forb. Okay, a forb is a fancy name for a wildflower or a weed. You can take your pick, either one. So it's basically not grass. So grasses are different from forbs. So everything that all the wildflowers and weedy things just look really pretty, those are forbs.
Can we thank Professor Nilon one more time for a great presentation?